Washington Journal continues.
Lori Garver served as the NASA Deputy Administrator during the Obama administration. She's the author of the book, Escaping Gravity, My Quest to Transform NASA and Launch a New Space Age. Lori Garver, welcome to C-SPAN.
Thank you for having me.
Let's talk about today's launch of Artemis I, the fact that it's scrubbed right now. Was that expected?
I think there was a really good chance it wasn't going to go today. Most rockets have weather to deal with and working through some technical kinks, but for a first-time rocket of this complexity, I think it was expected. So many of my friends and colleagues down there in Florida, I feel bad for them, but this really shouldn't have any bearing on the long-term operations, because I think we're going to work through a couple of these things probably over the coming weeks.
Will there be motivation to keep working through because of setbacks like this?
Well, of course. There have been so many setbacks, though. I think that the motivation is there. NASA wants to launch this rocket after, gosh, it's been more than 10 years in the making. And while there aren't people on it, prepping for a launch that will carry people eventually is something I think they take a lot of care to do. And they're familiar with the different elements of this rocket because so many are reused from the space shuttle, but it's an entirely different configuration. And it's a new generation of engineers for the most part. Most of these people didn't grow up, certainly at NASA, with Apollo. And so they are learning the ropes, and I think they're going to be very careful about not launching. I mean, today wasn't even a question of whether you would scrub with this problem. They need to understand it before they can move forward.
You served during in the Obama administration as Deputy Administrator from 2009 to 2013, if I correct. Did you have any role in today's launch?
Well, not at all in the sense of, I never touched a piece of hardware, but this vehicle was created during the Obama administration. We did not propose building such a vehicle. We proposed that the private sector was the right way to go forward with launching, since we have done it for 50 years, and that NASA should focus on those things that we do once we're in space. But Congress had a different idea and put the money in for this rocket back in 2010 when I was at NASA. That is not entirely the whole story, however, because NASA people, industry people who had these contracts on the space shuttle, they wanted to continue. So I would not say this was forced on NASA by any stretch. It was forced on the Obama administration, who didn't feel this was the proper path, and we have seen the success of the private sector. But this rocket is bigger. This rocket is something that the industrial base feels should be their lane to do deep space launches, and now that we have the private sector trying to do that as well, I think there are chapters yet unwritten. So
it's territorial.
It's very territorial, which in my view is just so wrong. Our government isn't here to compete with the private sector. That's on science fiction movies. The government should be driving the technology, allowing the private sector to lower costs, innovate, and do these things so that NASA can do the next thing. So there is some big policy questions ahead. This was a very expensive undertaking. We were told it would be $10 billion. It's been $23 billion. That's just the rocket. The capsule was going to be $8 billion. It's been another 20. So I don't think, again, today's scrub really has too much to do with all that, other than this is a complex system, and the government has been working it for so long, for so much money. They are going to continue.
Our guest with us until 10 o'clock. If you have questions for her, you can call on the lines, 202-748-8000 for those of you in the Eastern and Central time zones, 202-748-8001 in the Mountain and Pacific time zones. You can text us at 202-748-8003. The title of your book is Escaping Gravity, My Quest to Transform NASA and Launch a New Space Age. Where was the greatest area of transformation needed, in your opinion?
It was actually in the rockets and how we were going to go about working with the private sector to launch the rockets. Today's launch was a partnership in a way with Boeing and Rocketdyne and Lockheed and Northrop Grumman. All the big aerospace companies were paid cost plus contracts to build this. That's one of the reasons it was so expensive. the transformation that I thought was necessary, and not just me, many people, really since I was even at NASA in the 90s, we all felt the space shuttle would be followed on by rockets that were owned and operated by industry, not the government. And that didn't happen for a variety of reasons, the main one being the constituency interest in keeping these contracts. So we were able to transition and transform human space launches, astronaut launches to the space station, but not deep space. So the transformation is certainly not complete.
You write in part this, the transformation we were advancing was doing exactly that. It was threatening a way of doing business, a business worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Their protectionist response was to lash out and cast blame without visible support from the president or NASA administrator. I became the target and was accused of threatening to destroy human spaceflight forever. My quest to make space more accessible and sustainable wasn't meant to start a war. I wasn't trying to steal the future. I was on a rescue mission. It wasn't just Earth's gravity we must overcome. It's the gravity of the situation. That's the quote. Give the context of that.
The context of that is that NASA, since Apollo, has been wanting to just repeat doing the same things. And it's natural for a bureaucracy. It's natural for government, the relentless momentum of the status quo. NASA is supposed to be about the future. And the things that we have benefited most from NASA is when we were aligned with the national goals and helping achieve those. But NASA's been separate, and they're sort of a little family of their own that likes doing these things. They like doing things like building this big rocket and trying to launch it. And I was attacked because the head of NASA was an astronaut. He actually liked the status quo. And President Obama really wanted the very best for the space program and for NASA, and was aligned with this transformational vision. But when it came to votes on the Hill and arm-twisting senators who had a lot of these jobs in their districts, they put forward the right budget, but they didn't really use their political trades to get it passed. They were focused on healthcare, for instance. So I did end up having to spearhead this and taking a lot of shots. I think I was an easy target. I think that has played out in a way that now most people recognize I was on the right path, and the commercial space launches have been brilliant. SpaceX has delivered well more than I think NASA ever would have envisioned. And this rocket, NASA's rocket, has been harder, taken longer, and been more expensive than they envisioned either.
When you wrote that, who was administrator at the time?
Charlie Bolden. He was the head of NASA, and I worked for him. He was an astronaut, Marine general. Currently, Bill Nelson is the head of NASA, and he was a senator from Florida who really, if you had to say who is responsible for us having this rocket, you had to name someone, it would be him. And I think he'd be pleased with the credit. And now he's head of NASA. He calls it the monster rocket. And it has been a monster.
So as far as philosophy is concerned, Charlie Bolden, Bill Nelson has the same kind of philosophy when it comes to SLS and things built by NASA.
They did have the same philosophy, and probably not too surprising since they were crewmates on the space shuttle early on in 1986. Bill Nelson was a congressman who got a ride on the shuttle as part of NASA's promotional activities at that time to keep the program sold to Congress. And Bill Nelson really forced President Obama's hand to get Charlie appointed to the position. So that is what led to all this. And again, it isn't like there's something with SLS that is just fundamentally not going to work. I still think it could work, but at what cost? And the opportunity cost is the real question.
What do you mean by that?
What could we have done with this $43 billion over the last 12 years besides build a rocket and a capsule that will likely within maybe a year, certainly within a couple years, be overtaken by the private sector without tax investment. So these big rockets that are being developed by Elon Musk's company and Blue Origin, which is Jeff Bezos's company, they are reusable. They are so much cheaper. They use modern technology. I mean, the problem this morning was a space shuttle engine. You know, those were designed in the 1970s. If you're having a futuristic space program, do you really envision you're going to use a technology from 50 years ago?
Let's hear from a caller. This is from Dale in Maryland. You're on with Lori Garver, author of Escaping Gravity, My Quest to Transform NASA and Launch a New Space Age. Dale, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I am retired from NASA in 2005, and I met Mr. Bolton at a Hubble gathering. He was the commander that put the Hubble spacecraft out into, or the Hubble telescope out into space. That was very exciting for me. But anyway, I have a specific question regarding a satellite that I used to work on when I retired. It was called Earth Resource Budget Satellite. And in 2005, we decommissioned it, and it was going to have to circle for 17 years before it deorbits. Well, here it is 17 years later, and it's scheduled to come in 2023, I understand. And there's a problem with the spacecraft. The tank is made of titanium. It carried benzene gas, and that tank will not burn up on reentry. And I was wondering if NASA is tracking this. I mean, you may not know the details, but will there be any warning as that space debris will be coming in sometime next year?
Caller, thanks.
You know, I don't know the specifics of this particular satellite. Assuming it is still intact, it is most certainly being tracked, and if they're, as they should be doing, we leave propellants on board to direct it into a deorbit situation that will degrade and therefore splash into the ocean and not on habitable land. We have done this successfully many, many times. There are examples when it hasn't worked, Skylab being the one, I think, back in the 1970s, that was even little parts of it came over Australia, and no one was hurt. But still, these are issues NASA working with their counterparts and Space Command, because they do a lot of this tracking as well. For a fully operational satellite, they should very much be able to direct it into the correct termination point on Earth.
When it comes to the goal of Artemis itself, eventually Mars, what do you think of that ambition?
I think the goal of Artemis is positive and the right direction. Going back to the moon in a way that is sustainable, that is different than Apollo. We've always said since we went, next time will be not just flags and footprints. Not that that's all we got from Apollo, but going in a way that reduces the cost, allows you to develop a base. We are going to the South Pole this time, which I also think is a very unique aspect of this mission, in order to potentially be able to mine water that's been trapped in ice in the shadows of the South Pole craters on the moon. That could allow you to reduce the cost, again, for more sustainable space exploration beyond that to Mars. Most people are excited about that. I think that vision is the right one. It's a question of what are you going to get out of it? And in my mind, what we got out of Apollo was not just global leadership, but it was driving technologies that return incredible benefits to society, and that first view of the Earth from space. That caller was just talking about an Earth remote sensing satellite. That is a huge, important thing that we have been able to do from space. So if you are really working in a way that expands our sphere outward, in a way that I think international cooperation and partnering with the private sector can be a very meaningful thing to do. How much money are we putting into something that is already being done by industry is my greatest concern about the way we're doing this mission. Of
the private industry, do they have specific plans or designs that would support what the SLS and Artemis is currently doing? Yes.
Surprising even to me, since I haven't been at NASA for a while, SpaceX is not only transporting astronauts to and from the space station, they're developing on their own dime a rocket called Starship, fully reusable, two-stage. They've been testing it. It goes up. It hasn't gone to orbit yet, but it lands. So reusable means not parachuting into the ocean and just lifting somebody out. It's landing on a tail of fire as we've seen them land their boosters that are being discarded after launching people and satellites and spacecraft. So SpaceX has now gotten a contract from NASA to land astronauts on the moon. So this SLS and Orion, even if it goes successfully here later this week or in the months to come, can't land anyone on the moon. So NASA did a competition, SpaceX won it. What NASA envisions is Orion will dock with SpaceX's Starship to take them to the moon. Well, how do we think Starship's going to get there? It's going to launch. It's going to do the same things that SLS and Orion. There are some complexities. They need to refuel on orbit, et cetera. But yes, if it works, it will be redundant ultimately. And NASA requires it to work to land on the moon. So that's what's really interesting about this dual path we're on.
This is from Morton. Morton in Michigan. Hello, you're on with our guest.
Thank you very much. I'm 84. When the Sputnik fiasco started, the government panicked, and it didn't need to panic because the Russians at that time had a very, very crude atomic bombs, and to launch a little beeping satellite from a big rocket that they had for their real heavy crude weapons was no big challenge. I really want to go to a point about Joseph Wood Crouch. Before, right after Kennedy made his statement about the moon, Crouch wrote a book or an article about why I am not going to the moon. And if he were alive, I think he would write another book about why I'm not going to Mars. The situation here is well stated by your presenter, in that we're spending so much money, and I hate to remain. I ran the third largest planetarium in Michigan, and I have on my shelf about 18 pages of federal hearings about Apollo 1, and then we have Challenger, and some Columbia problems. And I wholeheartedly agree, if they're going to go with, as she indicated, the private sector.
Caller, thanks.
Thank you. Well, I'm from Michigan, so of course I'm going to resonate with your comments. And I do talk about early Sputnik in my book, Escaping Gravity, and I have the same sense as the caller. This was something that we reacted to, and in the book I reveal some of the documents released by the CIA 50 years after the launch that showed Eisenhower was not at all frightened of it. He sent Khrushchev a thank you note, or a congratulations note, and was secretly quite pleased they had done it first, because it then kept it from being a problem when we did. So it in itself was not threatening, but I know the sort of some of the same forces that are keeping all this going got their start then trying to make that something that was really challenging. I appreciate that these are things that, yes, we should be doing, but at what cost? I think that's really the question.
This is from Lily. She sent us a text this morning asking the question, what do you think happened to the country that made us lose enthusiasm for space, and why is space so important to understand better?
I'm not sure we've lost our enthusiasm for space. First of all, we have a myth around, I think, everyone being excited about the first time we went to the moon. Of course it was exciting. It was a first. There were protesters there. You know, not everyone agrees with everything. If you look at the things that NASA's doing, like the Webb telescope right now, there is so much enthusiasm. NASA as an agency, I think, has more Twitter followers than any government organization other than the White House. And for something like the Webb telescope, photographs, images that have come out, you're getting millions and millions of people interacting with these on social media, and I think academics are already rewriting textbooks. So there's a lot of interesting excitement for space. Human spaceflight is ultimately exciting for people, and when you look at the launches now to the space station, I think people who don't agree about a lot of things do agree that is a positive force for humanity. Again, it's just a question of how you do it and maximizing the value.
There's another viewer. This is from Wisconsin. This is Erwin asking if a war in space is inevitable.
I certainly hope not. I think that we all recognize that there are assets in space that help our warfighters, that help us communicate and know our geopositioning and so forth, but escalating that to an actual war in space, I mean, we all use these satellites in orbit, and we all will suffer if, as we have seen a couple of times, you have anti-satellite incidents where you get a debris field that is going to make it difficult to operate in space. These are big questions, and industry is working in concert with government to be able to both have, some resiliency within our space operations, but hopefully not as far as a war.
How should we look at China and Russia as far as their space operations?
The United States, in my view, is a clear leader. In human spaceflight, there's really not much question. We are partnering with the Russians on the space station. That has, of course, become more complex this year, but we have plans such as what we're doing now, going back to the moon with Artemis, that are well beyond. China has really started space stations there like where we were in the 1970s and 80s. But for overall space technology, the U.S. is undoubtedly the leader and needs to stay there. And these are things that don't have as much to do with NASA, but our national intelligence is very tied to space assets. And all of that is enhanced right now, I think, by these partnerships with industry, where they are able to be more nimble. Lowering the launch costs has created huge benefits for our nation. And the other countries aren't yet having those advancements.
Lori Garver with us for this conversation. Let's hear from Carl in West Virginia. Go ahead.
Yes, NASA is a waste of taxpayers' money. The defense industry is way beyond human comprehension of what we've done in space. We've been beyond the moon. The problem is our bodies have to get adapted to space. You lose 3 senses of the 6 senses that you have once you leave the planet. I guess you can guess what they are. So that's why we haven't traveled any further than the moon, because we can't live out there. We're bound to Earth, and this is where we're going to stay.
Okay, caller, thank you.
There's a lot of people who share that view, and I don't. I do believe, probably more than a lot of people at NASA, that there are some really great challenges ahead for humanity moving beyond low Earth orbit. Radiation is something we have to understand, but we know we can protect with shielding. How long it takes us to travel into space is something that we need advancements. You're not going to spend years going places, and I think even the round trip for Mars is at a point where humans will have a hard time being able to sustain that. But this is one of the reasons I think it's maybe not for the government to spend huge amounts of its money, because taxpayers, we're not in the Constitution. NASA's not in the Constitution. So to the extent that we are returning benefits of value, I think, which do include our national security as well as our welfare, and certainly our economic advancement. These are things that honest people can disagree about, but we haven't yet reached the limits, in my view, of how humans can expand into space.
This is from Kevin in Ohio. Hi.
Hey, guys. First time getting through. I'm so excited. Man, I was 6, 7 years old. Apollo was, man, that was all I thought about. And jets, I lived by an Air Force base, jets breaking the sound barrier, and F-86s, and the moon landing was just over the top for me. And listening to Neil deGrasse Tyson on a YouTube segment he does, talk about how when we lost, when NASA started to privatize, and we lost that momentum in the space program, killing the shuttle et cetera, how it affected maybe America's morale a little bit. I just, I served in the Air Force and saw many different aircraft made by Grumman and Lockheed, et cetera, North American Rockwell, the B-1 bomber. This Jeff Bezos, this privatization thing just smacks of politics. And if you could just do like the military does and contract out Airbus or Grumman or whoever, and then the American people own the equipment and own the software and the hardware and all of that. You're talking, and I hear this small government in between the lines. I hear this stuff in government is a good thing.
Okay, gotcha, caller. Gotcha. Thanks.
Yeah, those are great points. Of course, the space shuttle was a 30-year program, and it was bipartisan when it was canceled. The Bush administration canceled it. When the Obama administration came in, we asked, and there wasn't any way to really extend those third-tier contractors. And NASA does, like we are for the SLS rocket and Orion capsule, contracting with the private sector just like the Defense Department. But when we do have private sector investing their own money, whether those be aerospace companies or the companies owned by these billionaires, that is advancing our economic welfare. And Boeing, for instance, is one of the winners of the competition to launch astronauts to space. They just haven't yet been successful in doing that. So they are competing with SpaceX, who happens to be doing it better for less money, but they are transporting our astronauts. And instead of spending $1 billion an astronaut to get to the space station, as we did in the old days, it's, we're paying about $60 million a seat.
There was a time when we relied on the Russians to do that. And I think I've read correctly, you went through cosmonaut training yourself.
Well, yes, that's a bit strong, but as I outline in the book, I spent a time in Star City, Russia. I was medically certified to go to space, and this was to be a private space flight. It was before the Columbia shuttle accident when NASA needed those seats. And the Russian Space Agency was selling the seats. So I had sponsors. As I say in the book, when I was there, Lance Bass from the boy band NSYNC showed up, and we did some training together, which was fun. But you'll have to get the book to hear those stories.
Again, the Escaping Gravity, My Quest to Transform NASA and Launch a New Space Age is the title of the book. You use a term in the book called cup guys. Who are they?
So I call the people who primarily are retired military folks who are at NASA, and they tend to support continuing the status quo instead of being more innovative. They came to NASA because they liked what we were doing, and so it's understandable that they want to keep doing the same thing. And groupthink, as we know, can be, a little stifling, and I think it has held back progress. There are cup boys that aren't, I called them that because it was their military call signs that were on their coffee mugs. And it was a little exclusionary. There weren't many women. I first went to NASA in the 1990s, in 1996. It was not a political post. So I think that over time we have successfully, for the most part, diversified NASA, and that, but there are still cup boys in charge.
How were women treated at NASA when you were there?
I had better experiences at NASA really than in the private sector. I was attacked for my views, and I think some of that was with gendered language. And again, I was a softer target since the administrator was a military Marine general and astronaut. And I think we aren't yet to a point, certainly in fields like aerospace that is predominantly male, where we like having women have opinions that we disagree with, and we have to follow them. So coming up through the space industry, I was the first woman on one of the corporate boards, Maxar. I think I was the first woman on the NASA Advisory Committee back in the 90s. But we have made a lot of progress.
Here's Rose. Rose is in South Carolina. Hi.
Hi. My question is very practical. scientist, but I heard recently that there are something like 5,000 satellites in the stratosphere, atmosphere, wherever, and that there's a whole lot of space trash up there. And I was sort of wondering, what's happening with cleaning up the trash and getting? Why do they need so many satellites? Different countries putting satellites up, and how does that affect the sun rays hitting the Earth and things like that contribute to global warming?
Caller, thank you. And we have somebody who's tweeting us this morning a similar question. They write that who is in charge of watching all the space junk? Is space junk dangerous? If we need to fix it, who will pay?
There are, after now more than 50 years of a space program, a lot of leftover satellites, like a previous caller and so forth, in orbit, various orbits around the Earth. But space is not crowded per se. It is still so vast. This has not been a huge issue so far, but it needs to be governed more completely. I think we have a shared responsibility in the U.S. between the Air Force, now Space Command, and NASA. But luckily, we have a natural force, gravity, that degrades these the space debris, whether they're smaller pieces or larger satellites. And over time, those orbits degrade and they burn up in the atmosphere. So there is a natural cleansing. That doesn't mean it isn't a problem, because some of the higher orbits can take decades, if not centuries, to fully degrade. So we are assuring, at least now, commercial satellites that are launched have the ability to, when they're almost out of fuel, put themselves in a retrograde orbit where they will not become space debris. But we are a long ways from solving this problem.
We saw the last administration develop this Space Force, and one of the things they took a look at satellites. Is this a necessary move, do you think, or was it being met by other things already existing?
The Space Force has universally within the military, I think, been embraced already. It's something people thought of well before President Trump. They were very much encouraged when he did it. And this is one of just a handful of things that President Biden has continued. I think it was far enough along, but also we really are. I mean, space is a domain that is new compared to, say, the atmosphere when we first flew, or the sea when we first knew how to cross it. And each of those vantages have been used for a variety of important missions, if you will, including science, transportation, national security, as well as entertainment and tourism.
Thomas from Minnesota. Hello, you're on.
Yes, good morning. Two comments. The first being that I think that in response to the last caller, all of these satellites, there are now 2,300 scheduled for Earth, for orbiting the Earth in the near future, really steal my quiet enjoyment of the night sky. I can't go out and look at the sky without seeing a lot of satellite pollution in the evening. The second comment I would make is that I think the space program is now being fostered or supported by once again, a militaristic anxiety over who's going to control this or who's going to control that. NASA administrators are increasingly talking about competing with other countries. This is the kind of thing, I think, that we're not a mature enough species to be exploring space at this point. We need to take care of the intractable problems we have here on the planet. This is a waste of resources, pure and basic scientific research produces far more than the space program, and it's not accurate.
Got your point, caller. Thanks.
Yeah, and I get the point as well. And I think as far as the night sky that used to be darker, we have a lot of tension with Starlink, especially the 2,300 satellites that you mentioned. And they are trying to, at SpaceX, I believe, do shading and pointing of their satellites so that it isn't as disruptive to astronomy. The question generally about the military-industrial complex, again, I do get into in the book because I too fear it has taken over the program in ways that aren't as productive as we could be if we really focused on those unique scientific things that NASA could be doing. I mean, you talk about our problems here on Earth. Really, we have to remember so many assets in space are why we even know we have a problem with climate on Earth, or those Earth remote sensing satellites, and communications and positioning are things that each of us recognize, or should. We as humanity would not have the advances we do in a positive way without them.
You also point to members of Congress. You write, members of Congress who represent aerospace workers are often told by the industry what it needs to maintain or increase jobs in their districts. And when the government complies, the industry says it's acting on the government request. Once large contracts for jobs and infrastructure are awarded in key congressional districts, it becomes nearly impossible to change course. Dan and others have referred to this system as the giant self-licking ice cream cone.
Yes, and Dan in that section is Dan Golden. He was the head of NASA for 10 years, longest-serving NASA administrator from the early 90s to the early 2000s, worked for 3 presidents, 2 different parties. So he really, I think, had the right idea, and I sort of learned from him because I worked for him for 5 years, that this industry, the giant self-licking ice cream cone, is not unique to NASA. When you get contracts in a particular district, it's the member's job to want to continue those contracts, and it's certainly the company's job to keep them. So I think what's missing is national leadership on the part of the president and the administration in order to set policies that incentivize the right behavior for the companies. And I think if only a handful of members of Congress are paying attention, maybe your goals aren't yet tied to national goals. And in Apollo, all of Congress was paying attention to what was happening at NASA. Right now, it's only those few committee leaders who are from those states because they self-select their committee leadership positions. And that's what becomes, I think, this less healthy system.
How did you get involved in space?
My first job was working for John Glenn, right in this building, as a matter of fact. His presidential campaign in 1983 and 1984 brought me to Washington from college. And from there, I went to a place called the National Space Society. It was founded by Wernher von Braun in the 70s to help advance the space program when post-Apollo, the public wasn't as interested. So I've been doing this for nearly 40 years. I have a master's in science, technology, public policy, emphasis on space policy. And these are issues that are really important to the nation.
Here's Joseph from Texas. You're on with Lori Garver. Go ahead.
Lori. Pedro, everybody, hello. I'm Joseph, and I got a question about that new program the Trump administration wanted to start up, Space Force, and how is the FAA and other Space Force? How is it coming together, and how does NASA play a part in this program? Thank you.
Sure. The Space Force, as we mentioned, is coming together. It was a President Trump initiative with a lot of support in the military, certainly some controversy, but President Biden continued it. The FAA, NASA, all have a lot of interaction. Of course, these are extremely complementary systems because we travel through the atmosphere to space. The FAA is very involved in that. And of course, if anything is going to degrade from orbit, we have a similar problem as we've been talking about. I think the coordination, as always, could be better. There's probably more duplication than there needs to be, but in general, you have to accept, and especially when the FAA is mentioned, I really like to point out how safe our systems are here, and I also had a job managing the Airline Pilots Association, and if you look at commercial aviation in this country and its safety record, as well as our safety record for NASA, we are doing very well. And I think coordinating with the Space Force is something that they have managed.
You use another term in the book, space pirates. Who are they?
Space pirates are my early colleagues at the National Space Society. They really believed that we were going into space. We needed to lower the cost. And while the space shuttle was exciting to people, it was very expensive. And therefore, we knew it wasn't going to create the spacefaring civilization that was really the goal of the National Space Society. Ultimately, there were a number of people, companies, even billionaires before Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos who put money into rocket companies, hoping to get the market share for launches back to this country. But Elon and Jeff are probably the most famous space pirates today. The moniker being similar to pirates on the open seas. You are pushing the boundaries, perhaps beyond where there are even laws and regulations yet. And they're the heroes to some and the villains to others.
So, because you use your first name, do you know them personally?
Oh, of course.
What did you think about the criticism when they launched their various spaceships? People went to Twitter criticizing billionaires and their play toys and things like that. What did you think of that criticism?
As I say in the book, we have to separate our views of these people as individuals from their accomplishments. Certainly, their advancements in space, especially Elon and SpaceX, have been so numerable. I mean, they've saved tens of billions of taxpayer dollars in what they have been able to do helping NASA. It's a very complementary relationship. Blue Origin is on their way to doing that as well, aren't as far along. But those suborbital rockets that Bezos and Richard Branson flew, and I know Richard as well, your tax dollars aren't going to them. And so they are doing this, and they've put their money into it. It's their money. In my view, the issue that I would take is maybe we should have a different tax code or regulations in order to manage that better. It is not, they're not breaking the law by investing into rocket companies, and I think that a lot of that has been very positive.
Do you think there's a future NASA, especially as younger people come through the program, to eventually make privatization more of a commonplace within the agency itself? It's
happening. NASA is embraced commercial partnerships. And again, we've always partnered with industry. NASA worked with Rockwell and Northrop and Grumman to do Apollo. So we are just now contracting in a way that is more beneficial to the public because we aren't doing it for the first time. And industry has an incentive, for instance, for launching. If you can launch a government payload, that means you can launch a commercial satellite. The United States had lost the entire launch market 20 years ago. So we weren't getting the return to this country that had been lost to China, France, and Russia. So now we are, in the U.S., the #1 provider of launches around the world, and that has really helped our bottom line. So I think NASA is embracing this in many ways. It's a transitional period.
As far as funding is concerned, what argument would you make to Congress about the current funding and where it should be? I think $26 billion set aside and $7 billion or $8 billion for spaceflight itself and associated things. Where should that number be, do you think?
I think NASA has a healthy budget, and $25 billion. I mean, there's been people comparing us to Apollo, and you can use a percentage of the budget, a percentage of the GDP, but in actual purchasing power, we're still getting to the point. Someone said yesterday, but I would have to run the numbers, that it's the same purchasing power as we had during Apollo. I think it's less. But the bottom line is NASA is an investment in the future, and I don't have any issue with the amount of money. I think we should be spending it in ways that really have the most value and return to the taxpayer.
Lori Garver served as the former NASA Deputy Administrator in the Obama administration. She's the author of the book, Escaping Gravity, My Quest to Transform NASA and Launch a New Space Age. Thanks for giving us your time.
You're welcome.
That's it for our program today. We now take you to an event sponsored by the American Enterprise Institute, a conversation with the U.S. Air Force Chief of Staff General Charles Brown about defense strategy. We take you to that program just about to start.